So thank you so much everyone for joining us today. Absolutely delighted to welcome you all to our webinar, which is The Perfect Storm, AI and Security. Joining us today, we have Ollie Potts, who is our Head of Product here at Lima. We also have Laura Darnley, our guest speaker from Ward Hadaway, who'll be speaking after Ollie about some of the people and employment law parts of AI, the risks that are there. And I'm Cara Shorthouse, the market manager here at Lima. Just before I hand over to Ollie, just to give everyone a quick run through of what we're doing today. I'll hand over to Ollie shortly. He will give us a quick run through of Lima, and then he is going to talk about the public use of AI tools and the potential security risks that this can cause. We've then got guest speaker Laura, who, as I mentioned, will follow on from that section on the people side of AI, the risks from a data and a people perspective. We do have time for questions at the end. So please, as we're going, feel free to bang any questions that you have into the Q&A in Teams, and we will pick them up at the end, but fire them in as we go by all means. So I will hand over to you, Ollie, to get us started.
Thanks very much, Cara. It's really good to see some familiar faces on this webinar, but also a good mix of new as well. For those that are new, I'll just do a bit of an intro to Lima as a business and to me. So Lima is a really interesting business. We're a managed service provider. We've been going for 26 years, and we really specialize in being a consultative partner to our customers, and we use technology to understand and solve IT challenges and deliver business outcomes. And we do that with 6 capabilities. We do that through assessment services, so learning the lay of the land. We have the ability to distribute hardware from tier 1 and global manufacturers. We also offer consumption services, so our own private VMware-based cloud platform, for instance, and the ability to offer devices as a service. We have the capability to deliver full implementation through project delivery. Once those have been delivered, we can then support them post-sale in a lifetime-based support contract, and we also offer security services as well. So we can really cover that end-to-end piece and cover the full length and breadth of most IT requirements. I've been at Lima for about 3.5 years, and my role is to understand the needs of our customers and make sure that our products and services and those capabilities continue to align to what our customers require. And my focus for 24 and part of 25 is some of what we're about to speak about today, which is understanding the landscape of AI and making sure that we can help our customers navigate their way through successful activation and implementation, understanding business cases, and driving the use of AI safely within organizations. Alongside other areas and capabilities, this is one of my sort of key focuses for the year of 25. So if Cara could be nice enough to go to the next slide for me, I'm going to give you a brief overview as to what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, I just want to do a quick poll. So I've put some information on the slide here, but I'll do a quick poll just to gather an initial bit of information off you, if that's all right. So you should see on your screens now a question with a small answer. If you could answer for me the question: do you know or suspect that staff in your organization are using AI tools for work purposes? I think we've had pretty much everyone respond, which is fantastic. And it should be on your screens as well that we can see that the answer is an overwhelming yes. 85% of all of you that have responded believe that staff are already using AI in the workplace. Today, we're going to cover some of the risks of it. Laura's going to go through the internal risks, what it presents to a business in terms of challenge around people and data management. I'm going to come at this from an external point of view and say, well, how AI can bolster a successful or lead to a successful attack from an external threat perspective. 85% of you think that AI is already in use. Half of the IT community believe that successful cyber attacks from 23 and 24 can be attributed to the direct use of ChatGPT exclusively as a tool. And the underpinnings of that, we'll try and unpick some of that today. And I want to take you through, first off, go through how AI learns, how it gets its information into the model, how it generally improves, and how it constantly iterates itself. We'll go through how actually there probably is a need to lead governance inside an organization and not wait for law. Law typically happens or regulation happens after something has been implemented, and we'll cover why we might want to get ahead of that and start our own policies and usage. And we'll go through that exact underpinning of that stat there, why it's actually leading to successful compromises and how it's actually improving the success rate of a compromise. So first off, how does AI learn? AI is only as good as the data it's given, right? And it all depends on data. Now, if you're using a public-facing tool like ChatGPT or Google Gemini, that data is provided by those organizations and also public sources. So at this point, there's no human interaction with a tool. It will go out and scan, index, and correlate all the data it's given. And that's the first section, which is self-supervised training. The model supervises itself. It leads its own learning about the data that is ingested. Once that is complete, and it does take a while, the most recent, I think, GPT-4 uses over 10 billion data points. So it's quite a large amount of data. Once that's completed, there's then an element of human supervised training. So this is where humans will use the first iteration of the model. They will provide specific tailored prompts and measure the response, and they will offer feedback to the tool or to the model about how to improve. It's usually done inside a controlled environment. So at this point, the general public wouldn't have access to the model until the next stage, which is reinforcement learning. So this is why particular SMEs for specific topics about the data that's been ingested by the model will also then prompt the tool and will offer feedback to its responses. And after that has happened, it is conceptually a model that has been fine-tuned and ready for wide-scale consumption. There is a couple of interesting cases that I've seen recently where actually the information that the model has gathered is completely incorrect or factually not correct. An example being, I think they asked it to count the number of instances the letter R occurred in the word strawberry. And you would think, or natural processing would just be to count the number of instances of the letter. Because the model has to depend on the data it's given, it actually returned an incorrect answer. And it said there was one. And the person using the prompt at the time, or the model, then went back to it and said, no, that's incorrect. Can you take another look? It then offered the right answer afterwards. And that's an example of reinforcement learning and human supervised, where you prompt the model to give you information, you verify the accuracy of it, and if it is incorrect, you either advise the model why it's incorrect or you ask it to check again. That's an example of those two phases of training. Once the model has been fine-tuned and is available, it goes through a constant learning process. A good example of that would be, again, with publicly available tools. If the response you get from a prompt isn't exactly what you're after, either you need more information, more detail, or for instance, you need it to cite the sources, it will learn that you've asked that. And the next time you prompt it, it will give you that information already built in. So it'll learn how you like to receive information as well. And those are the sorts of 4 phases of learning from the model. If we can go to the next slide for us. That naturally does present quite a lot of risks. Unlike Google searches, where you put a search in, if you don't get the information you're after, you tailor it, albeit Google does learn quite a lot about you specifically. Most public-facing AI tools, as we've just kind of uncovered, go a bit further. And what businesses risk when they allow staff to use public-facing tools that incorporate AI is you actually run the risk of exposure of sensitive data. This is where staff will offer up potentially a document for review. An example that I came across yesterday was the use of Grammarly. So Grammarly now incorporates AI into its tooling. It never used to. Grammarly searches a document, understands the language that's been used, and recommends punctuation and spelling changes. That now incorporates AI. By handing those documents to the AI-based tool, there is potential for the data to then be collected, analysed, and inferred data to be produced upon it. And there's no real guarantee around whether that document is being retained somewhere else, as an example. The second is that we sacrifice accuracy, and a lot of this comes down to the person that's actually using the tool. The example of the strawberry spelling is a great example of this, where actually you do need to fact check the information that's given back to you. Almost as if you have found that information yourself, you would sanity check it. If you'd collated several sources yourself, you would check it before it's released. The next that we risk is unintentional response bias. Kind of goes in hand with checking the responses that are given from the tool, but because the model continuously learns, especially if it's public, it's actually gathering intelligence from a number of different people or users that consume the tool. It may over time develop bias. When it's first released, that bias may not be present. It depends on what it learns from the prompts and responses that are given over time. There is also the consideration of GDPR. So if you're handling information or documents that contain sensitive or protected information, ideally those should not be shared with AI tools, especially if they're public. And there's minimal guarantee of security or safety of data. And I say that because most tools that have AI incorporated into them right now are developed in the US. The US regulations and laws are obviously different to those present in Europe. And we need to consider, actually, if we've shared confidential or sensitive or protected data with a platform that's running in another country, have we violated GDPR? Coming on to the sort of final four, there is a risk of actually, if you provide that information to a tool, how long does it retain that for? So the prompts that you put in, how long does it retain the prompts for, and also the responses that are given? You may run the risk of producing a vendor lock-in situation where your business becomes dependent on one or two tools. You may also, if you're considering information sharing, both in prompts and in document form, if that actually contains intellectual property. So if you are sharing protected information, are you actually sacrificing the rights to that? And do you compromise your ability to protect your IP in the future? And then finally, the data that's shared both in prompt form and in document form can be used to aggregate, or more importantly, the tools or the operators will aggregate that data and produce their own inferred data based on the usage of the tool. And it's important to call out that you have no right to that information. That isn't effectively yours anymore. It's the organization that runs the tool. So it's very rare that you'll get access to that information. Where does all this go? So that we've called out sort of 8 key risks there that need to be considered. I'm going to call out 4 key risks that I think will become more prevalent in the future. And at that point, I'll then hand over to Laura to go over the internal risks, but this is purely from an external perspective. So the first one is this information that's shared with models, the model can then be used maliciously. It can be used to produce enhanced phishing attacks and more automated attacks. At the moment, end user security awareness training shows that you can spot a phishing email based on certain characteristics. It might be that the odd word isn't spelt properly or correctly. Maybe the sentence doesn't make sense. It might be that it doesn't make sense to the organization that it's been sent to. It might have been sent in error, and it might reference information that is just completely wrong. But with the information available through an AI tool, all of that can be reduced. Much like someone may ask Grammarly to spell check their completely legitimate work documents, in theory, a model can be used to spell check and check the wording of a phishing email. And if that were to happen, that may actually improve the likelihood of it bypassing spam checks, and it may actually improve the likelihood of the end user being successfully targeted. And what we've seen is over the last 2 years, phishing is one of the core ways of ransomware distribution that is successful still, and it's on the rise. So this is an example where the use of AI will bolster a malicious attack. And there's an example called out on the slide there that in 2020, a specific model that was created was actually used to generate emails from scratch and send them out en masse. And they targeted specific employees, and it did lead to a successful breach. The next one is a really interesting risk that I think could be surfaced. Cara, if you could go to the next slide for us, is that more often than not, malware has been traditionally written by people exclusively. And much like in the development of legitimate applications, AI has now been baked into things like Visual Studio Code, for instance. And you can ask a model to write for you a string of malware or a strain of malware. This is actually available inside common public-facing tools as well. You can ask, and this comes down to prompt engineering. You can ask it to explain how a piece of software could be created, and unfortunately, some of that could be used for negative or bad purposes. But we're in a situation where if AI's got access to public-facing code through the likes of GitHub, that it in theory could write, and it could manage its own iteration cycle of malware strains. It can also go and test them against particular environments or deployments, and it will learn from whether those attacks are being blocked by specific types of antivirus or anti-malware technology, and it will then improve, again, improving the likelihood of a successful attack. Albeit you'd need to chain certain attacks together, it is theoretically possible that this could be used for negative purposes. So the next one, Cara, if you could go to the next slide for us. The next one's around the compromise of the model itself. So if staff and users are very open to using multiple tools that have AI baked into them, at the moment, there's no guarantee that an organization has to give you around the legitimacy or the positive behavior of their model. The security of a model obviously is protected, but as we know that it continuously learns, in theory, you could poison it. And an example would again be that strawberry situation where somehow it's gathered the assumption that strawberry only contains 1R. And this is an example of where the data that's returned really needs to be checked. But it could go as far to say that actually, if you provide a prompt that it would provide a completely maybe inaccurate or irresponsible answer, and I know Laura's got some interesting examples of this coming up in her section, but there is a whole new breed of vulnerabilities now that are actively trying to discover. So vulnerabilities in public-facing AI tools, how they can compromise the model and poison the information in it, is now becoming a new market, and it didn't exist until 1 or 2 years ago. You could be in a situation where that response has been completely engineered for your consumption as well. So given that AI offers personal, tailored responses, the responses could be poisoned, and again, they could introduce bias. And that's kind of backed up by the fact that we don't really see many CVEs being raised for these tools at the moment. I think this is a very early stage well, this is at very early stages, but there hasn't been many CVEs released for public-facing AI tools. And the final one is around the increased ability for social engineering. So as we offer data to the tool around our prompt, as we tell the tool how we like to receive data, what data we are interested in, this could be used in the reverse context to allow the tool or the organization that runs the tool to understand my personal preferences in terms of the data that I like to, or that I commonly ask about. It could then be engineered for me to receive completely fake news, one that is targeted towards the specific reader. And actually, if that content isn't successful, it can redraft it immediately, and that's something that supercharges an attacker's ability, because that ordinarily would have been done by a human previously. So there's an example I call out there where AI was used to drive CEO impersonation, and it was actually mitigated, but the mitigation was only possible because of the layers of security that were in place by the organization, and those are anti-malware and EDR technologies, and a good level of anti-spam and email protection, and MDR response services. So all of that allowed the organization to mitigate an attack that could have been successful. So we've gone through the sort of how a model learns, or how you can train a model. We've gone through the initial risks of consuming public services for AI, and I've covered 4 key risks. If we go over to the next slide, Cara, I'm going to hand over to Laura, who's going to tell us about the internal facing risks. And at the end, we've then got a chance for any questions as well to be asked. But thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Ollie, and good morning, everybody. Just by way of introduction, as Ollie's already said, my name's Laura Darnley. I'm a partner at Ward Hadaway, which is a top 100 law firm with offices across the north, so Leeds, Manchester, and Newcastle. We cover any legal needs that you might have. My personal specialism is in people-related issues, so employment law issues and business immigration issues. So that's a little bit about me. What I've been kindly invited to do by my friends at Lima today is to talk to you about some of the specific risks that you may face in relation to AI, in respect of the people within your business and how they might be using AI. So, Cara, if you'd kindly move on to the first slide, that would be great. So, as I think we saw, and as you correctly predicted, 85% of the people on this webinar think that AI is being used in their businesses, and I think that's absolutely correct. It's used in a number of different areas that we've seen as the AI tools develop. And I'm just going to go through just a few of them just to give you an idea of where this might come into play in relation to the people within your business. So, in terms of recruitment, AI might be used to identify the skills and qualifications or experience that's needed for a role. It might be used to source and screen your candidates. It might be used to scan CVs and application forms. It might be used by the employer to create really compelling job descriptions so that people want to apply for those roles. And that has some interesting issues associated with it. Personnel Today reported in December 2023 about AI enhancement of CVs. And when they ran a test with 100 real CVs in relation to a specific role, and they used ChatGPT to enhance them, the original CV scored a lot more poorly than the enhanced CVs. And perhaps it doesn't surprise you that ChatGPT was able to make the CVs more compelling. What might surprise you, however, is that the result also found that ChatGPT, on average, lied 14 times on each CV to embellish them and make them more compelling as compared to the job description. So particularly in relation to the profile section, their key skills and attributes, and enhancing professional experience. So what you can see there is that there's an inherent risk in relation to recruitment and the use of AI, where candidates may be misleading their prospective employers, and employers might not know that what they're getting is actually correct. And I think that's a really interesting point to bear in mind if that is the case in terms of people using AI in respect of recruitment. It might also be used in relation to onboarding, so chatbots answering employee questions, Managing remote workers, using data analytics to track performance, to track what people are doing, to track when they're logging on, specifically in relation to performance management, so allocating tasks and shifts, and we'll come back to some of those issues in a minute. Managing performance, so we're seeing the use of AI tools in selecting candidates for promotion, in analysing productivity, identifying cost-saving measures, monitoring attendance, rating productivity, and we're also seeing some of these AI tools being used to select employees for redundancy, to allocate work and shifts. And as I go through the next couple of slides, I'm going to highlight some of the legal issues that potentially arise as a result. Cara, if you could just move on to the next slide, please. So some of the practical issues that arise on a sort of very, very practical level in terms of when AI tools are being used is that often there's a real lack of clarity, a lack of transparency, a lack of common sense, and a risk of bias, which I'll come on to in a second. That lack of clarity, people may not know when AI tools are being used. And I think one of the questions in the chat was exactly that. How do we know what employees are using what tools? But equally, from a business perspective, your employees might not know what tools are being used and for when. A lack of transparency. How are the tools being used? What data is it sucking in? How is the tool making those decisions? What factors are being taken into account? It can be a bit of a dark art and a bit of a kind of sealed black box where people don't know exactly what is being taken into account and how those decisions are being made. A lack of common sense, the R's in strawberry. You can see that sometimes the AI tools spit out results that are nonsensical if you were to apply a sort of human review to them. And then there's a real risk of bias in terms of that learned behaviour. So coming back to some of the things that Ollie was talking about in terms of how the AI tool learns and develops. A really interesting example of this was Amazon was using AI tools, and in 2018 they had to stop using a recruitment tool based on AI because basically it was favouring all the male applicants. And what the tool had done was it had looked at the recruitment data from the past 10 years and had reached the conclusion that male candidates were better than female candidates. So what it was doing was penalising female CVs, penalising any CVs that had all women's colleges or sort of anything that referred to them as being a woman, and basically rejecting them from the recruitment. And that just goes to show how AI tools can perpetuate human biases when they are learning from that historic data. If we could just move on to the next slide, please, Cara. So just to take you through some of the key employment law risks, and I won't go into all the details for all of these issues, but I'll just run through some of the sort of key claims that you might be at risk of from a business perspective. The first risk is in relation to discrimination claims. And from a legal perspective, broadly speaking, what you're likely to see are two different types of discrimination claim arising from AI usage or potentially arising from AI usage. The first is direct discrimination. And that, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is where you treat one group who have protected characteristics less favourably than others because of that protected characteristic. So, for example, if you sack someone, if you don't put them through the recruitment process because they're a woman, that would be an example of direct discrimination. And that's unlawful. You can't, there's no excuse for that, basically. There's no defence in law. Second type that often arises is indirect discrimination. And that's effectively where you apply the same rules to everybody. So it looks like an unbiased policy, an unbiased practice that you're putting into place. But it puts people with a particular protected characteristic at a disadvantage, and you can't objectively justify it. So, for example, if as a business you required all of your workers to work 9 to 5, you might find someone challenging that on the basis of being indirectly discriminatory because it's harder for a woman with childcare responsibilities to meet that requirement. You as the employer would then have to objectively justify that treatment in order to avoid a finding of unlawfully indirectly discriminating against them. With the use of AI, some argue that AI tools should eliminate that discrimination. It shouldn't think about people's gender, people's race. It can be focused purely on skills, experience, metrics, etc. So a lot of people argue that AI is a really positive way of reducing the risk of discrimination issues. But as we've seen from the Amazon example, there's certainly the risk for inherent bias from learned behaviours that can lead to that discrimination risk. In addition, if there was an argument that somebody had been indirectly discriminated against, one of the ways that you would defend that claim as a business is to show how it was justified, how you needed to achieve a particular aim, and this was the way in which you needed to do so by applying that particular policy. And there's an issue there where there's a transparency void in terms of how the AI tools work. If you can't explain how they work, if you can't explain as a business what factors they've taken into account, it's going to be very difficult to justify any sort of direct, indirect discrimination outcome. So if it's led to the conclusion where people are being treated less favourably or look like they're being treated less favourably, you haven't got that explanation as to how you've got to the end point. And then coming back to something else that Ollie mentioned, a particular concern for me as a lawyer in particular is that the majority of AI tools are created in the US. And the discrimination legislation in the US is very different from the UK. So it's not going to have that same sensitivity or nuance to it. Unfair dismissal claims, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, anyone with more than 2 years service is protected from being unfairly dismissed. And that basically means that as an employer, you have to show a fair reason, and there's 5 permitted fair reasons for dismissing someone, and a fair process before you dismiss someone. In order to defend any potential claim that they've been unfairly dismissed. And you have to generally have acted reasonably before you decide to dismiss an employee. Now, when AI is starting to influence those decisions as to who's dismissed, you might find that the tool has spat out a decision to dismiss someone that doesn't relate to a fair reason. Or you might find that it's unreasonable when you look at it in the round. You know, there's an irrational or an unfair decision-making element in the AI tool, particularly when the managers don't understand how the algorithms work or how to interpret and use the data. So one example, which the Ada Lovelace Institute looked at, was where various businesses have started to use AI shift allocation tools. And what they've done is they analyse the data about workers' availability and their productivity, and if they are not consistently accepting shifts, they will then terminate employment. And they found that that was likely to fall foul of the unfair dismissal provisions. In addition, there was another case in March 2022 where 3 individuals who were employed by MAC, cosmetics company, brought a claim against Estee Lauder when they were selected for redundancy following an AI automated video interview. And the headlines were, you know, sacked by algorithm, etc. They basically said this was completely unfair. The AI tool didn't assess their skills properly. They didn't understand how they were being assessed. They shouldn't have been made redundant. Estee Lauder defended the case, but ultimately it settled out of court. And that's another example of how this may become an issue. Now, just very briefly, there can be whistleblowing issues where people allege that, you know, AI tools are not taking into account the proper information, or where it's leading to problems in how. So the example that that was most prevalent is this particular case where an individual was working in a GP surgery. An app was being used which had AI built into it to triage patients and book appointments. And he said, you know, there's a risk. I think there's a risk here that the AI tool is not making sure that people get the right care that they need, and potentially very vulnerable patients may not have answered the tools correctly and therefore may not have got an appointment. And he was ultimately treated less favourably because he'd made that allegation, or that's what he said, and he raised a whistleblowing complaint on that basis. So again, you can see that there can be issues about disclosures of information within AI and how the AI tools are being used that could again lead to particular claims. Data protection, massive issue. I'm not a data protection lawyer by any stretch, but massive issue in terms of the data going into AI tools, what data is being collected, whether it's being processed properly. Do the employees know what data is being collected? Does it include special category data? Is there confidential information being put in, which kind of goes hand in hand with the data protection issues? Massive potential risk for businesses in respect of fines and reputational damage. And then just finally, there might be an issue with regards to human rights in terms of the right to privacy, in terms of what AI tools are collecting. So just to kind of flesh this out a bit, give you some example of some cases. The first case is an Uber Eats case, where a particular individual driver was being assessed for shifts on a facial recognition check. And for some reason, the facial recognition software couldn't recognise his face, and he kept getting refused shifts, and ultimately he was removed from the Uber Eats platform. He wasn't given a chance to appeal. There was no sort of human intervention. It was automatic. And he brought claims, as you can see on the slide, for indirect race discrimination, victimisation and harassment in October 2021. It was listed for hearing in November of this year, but ultimately Uber Eats decided to settle the case. Now, the Equality and Human Rights Commission were really concerned because AI was directly leading to people being suspended from the platform, meaning that they couldn't earn a living. The App Drivers and Couriers Union was really concerned about the facial recognition checks, and in particular, the fact that it seemed to have a disproportionate impact on individuals of an ethnic minority. Uber have said, absolutely not at fault. We think the tool works perfectly fine. Microsoft, who run the technology, have admitted previously that their facial recognition software doesn't work as well for those of ethnic minorities. So I think this case really highlights the potential for those sorts of discrimination claims. And then the second case I wanted to look at was Harbour and the Commissioners for His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And although this is a tax tribunal case, I think it highlights the need to be aware of the risks of AI and those nonsense results. So in this case, an individual was presenting their claim, and in support of their claim to the tax tribunal, they cited various cases, and they've been given to them by a friend who has legal background. And the tribunal said, look, these cases, they're not real, they don't exist. And what it turned out was that the cases had been generated by AI and were completely made up. Now, the Solicitors Regulation Authority have also raised concerns of these kind of legal hallucinations created by AI tools. So the content sounds, plausible, but they're completely incorrect. And this obviously translates to the workplace more generally in terms of those risks about what you're putting into AI, what comes out of AI, and whether there is any kind of human intervention to check, to sense check, to make sure that it does make sense in terms of what individuals are presenting. If we could just move on to the next slide. I was going to just briefly touch on the sorts of regulations that apply. Now, in the UK, there isn't any specific regulation, certainly not yet, in relation to the use of AI by businesses. In the EU, we do have an AI Act, which is meant to regulate and increase transparency, to create those checks and balances on how AI is used, try and making sure that there's clear requirements for how they're being used, and where there are some issues on sort of harmful outcomes, that they're reviewed. The TUC had proposed a private members bill to regulate it in a very similar way, and in particular, making sure that high-risk decisions were going to be reviewed by a human eye, but that was superseded by the general election. The new government has been a bit short on detail in terms of what they propose. I think there will be some sort of specific regulation, but the King's Speech in particular didn't suggest a specific AI bill. So what can you do to manage those risks? What might you do in terms of sort of addressing those? Well, I think you need to be keeping up to date with new cases and new legislation. There is various parts of government guidance and ICO guidance that you can refer to. So there's guidance about using it in the recruitment sector, ICO guidance in terms of data protection. The Institute for the Future of Work has developed a good work algorithmic impact assessment. I mean, really, the issue is, you need to be able to explain and justify how you're using those AI tools. You need to be thinking about, should you be using AI here? Are there ethical considerations? Do you have a policy about how it's going to be used? What data is going to be collected? Do you cover it in your privacy notices? Do you communicate this to your employees? I think there should be some level of human intervention and oversight. If you're going to take AI into account when deciding people's future in your business or promotion, at least allow for an appeal at least allow for a human eye to look at it at some point, look at those risk assessments, monitor the outputs to see if there are any issues or trends, and make sure that you've trained individuals on exactly what you're using, how you're using it, and the risks associated with it. And that, I think, was everything I wanted to say in respect of those employment law risks. So I'll hand back over to Ollie.
Thanks very much, Laura. I completely agree with all the risks that you've called out and the ways of managing them. I just wanted to surface 3 things that Lima can do to help understand the risk exposure and manage the implementation of AI across a business. The first thing we can do is a tailored security assessment. And this goes back to the external risks that I was calling out around how you best protect yourselves going forward. The next is around a specific activation assessment for Copilot. And Copilot is, for 365 especially, is very different to the public tools that we've called out today. It's a private instance of AI that can be deployed in an organization. Lima is going through our own journey in terms of using and justifying the use of Copilot. This actually represents the start of our journey. So all of our learnings from our analysis of risk, all of the preparatory works that we've done inside our own 365 environment have been baked into this assessment. And it's a journey that we're now offering out to customers. And the third is an organization-wide cyber resilience assessment, which focuses on uncovering and analysing 180 different controls around people, platform and process inside an organisation, and is a great way of understanding your current position, especially if you are targeting either first-time CE Plus certification, Cyber Essentials Plus, or the retention of your CE Plus certificate on a yearly basis. We have all the details in terms of how you access those from Lima, and I believe Cara is going to follow up with you, all the people that have attended today, just to offer that out to you all. And at that point, I will close for questions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Ollie. Yep, we've had a couple of questions come in, so let me just take a look. We've got one that came in earlier, Ollie. I think this one is probably best directed at you. It says, how can I find out what AI tools our staff are using?
Great question, and it's a great way to understand your current exposure. The way that we've found works the best, and one that we are actively trialing internally, is the use of Microsoft Purview. They have a browser extension that can be deployed to all machines. It will report back with tools that are being consumed by a work device. Doesn't report back on all the data shared just yet, but will tell you for certain tools what the prompt was, for example, but not the response, unless it's Copilot specifically. We'd recommend deploying that out, which can be done from the 365 Admin Center through Intune.
Thanks, Ollie. I think the second one possibly has been answered in Laura's, but it says, are there any specific regulations that apply to the use of AI in businesses? Do you want to pick that one up, Laura?
Yeah, sure. And just on the point about what Ollie was saying in relation to the first question, I think it is also helpful to have a policy in place about what tools you permit staff to use. So there's the very practical kind of what are they actually using on the ground, but equally a policy as to what they're allowed to use and what they're not allowed to use. So, for example, Samsung banned ChatGPT from its employees, and that's a clear policy statement that they've made because they found that individuals were putting highly sensitive information into ChatGPT in order to do their jobs faster and get better outcomes. So, if you have a policy around what you expect employees to use, I think that can also be helpful in terms of going some way to minimising those unknown tools that they might be implementing. Just on your question, Cara, in terms of specific regulations, there aren't any, and I think Ollie made a really good point in his section. The law does tend to lag behind. And it won't be, I suspect, for a little bit until we see regulations. I mean, it is something that the government has mentioned in its manifesto. There was a brief mention of it in the King's speech. But the Labour government has many priorities that are competing for its time and attention right now. And I don't see that AI is at the forefront of those. So I wouldn't expect something to be massively quickly implemented. We might see a right to disconnect, which was part of their AI proposals, although slightly divorced from them. That may be coming across based on speculation in the press over the last couple of weeks. But sort of AI regulation bill, I think we'll need to watch this space. But at the minute, it's all based on best practice recommendations and the existing legal framework, I'm afraid.
Just on that point as well, Laura, I think because of that, the deployments of AI are inconsistent across businesses. And all we can do, as you say, is follow good practice and try to lead a best practice implementation of AI. It's very different to deploying other types of technology where you could potentially accept risks or mitigations. In this situation, you're going to want to put your best foot forward with it. And I think if you're deploying AI and you've got a target to do that, potentially be prepared to realign with the law as it starts to emerge in coming years. So there'll be a need to reevaluate your deployment and maybe even provide documentation as to how it was deployed and how it has changed, more importantly, since deployment.
Absolutely. And I don't think you would go too far wrong to look at some of the European provisions in the AI Act in terms of what the European Parliament has legislated for. I'm not saying that the UK is going to be exactly the same, but that would seem to be quite a sensible starting point if you were looking for some sort of guidance or those best practice guidance pieces that I mentioned in my section, just to give you a kind of some sort of regulation to the Wild West that we can see developing if we're not careful.
Super. Thank you both. That's us for questions. I'm conscious we are up on time as well. So if anyone has any other questions or if they want to get in touch with Laura or Ollie, we'll send out follow-up details after the webinar. Please feel free to get in touch. Any questions, any thoughts, any follow-up, anything at all. And Laura and Ollie, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone for coming along today. I hope you found that useful, and we'll end it there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.